So first, I want to thank you for taking the time to view my talk titled Collaboration and Consent in Aerial Reconnaissance, a View from Rural Chiapas, Mexico. And today I will discuss the ethics of mapping large areas via the technique of aerial LiDAR. LiDAR is a remote sensing technology that provides high resolution landscape data, even in heavily forested areas, and as a result has been a major innovation in archaeological investigation. Although my specific focus is on aerial LiDAR, my presentation also touches on ethical issues tied to today's rapid pace of technological innovation. Across the globe, many people are grappling with how to regulate outer space, drone usage, or online companies such as Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon. Through my focus on LiDAR, I hope to ignite a much wider ethical dialogue on the use and regulation of technology in today's world. To build my argument, I discuss some LiDAR basics, including how the technology works. Next, I discuss how LiDAR is employed in archaeology and the impact that aerial versions of this technology are having on the field. Third, I examine how the growing ethical concerns that are tied to the use of, third, I examine the growing ethical concerns tied to the use of aerial LiDAR. And this discussion ties into wider issues in archaeology and remote sensing, such as stewardship, data sharing, and accessibility, also colonialism. Then I introduced the case study of Mensabak, Chiapas, Mexico. As part of a community-based archaeological project, I developed a program of informed consent that sought to decolonize the process of aerial LiDAR mapping through the active participation of indigenous descendants in the stewardship and study of their own heritage. Light detection and ranging, otherwise known as LiDAR, is a laser scanning technique that has existed for many decades, but really only began to find a place in archaeology in the 1990s. The basic premise behind LiDAR is similar to that of radar or the echolocation of bats. By releasing focused beams of energy, in our case light, and then measuring the return, investigators can calculate the distance of objects from the energy source. By piecing together multiple distance measurements, sometimes millions or billions of data points, one can create digital renderings of objects or landscapes. It is in the latter case that airborne laser scanning becomes important. To create a surface map of an entire city or region, researchers have developed laser scanners that can be mounted on an airplane to map entire regions in a matter of days. Since the pioneering research of the 1990s, the use of aerial LiDAR in archaeology has contributed new insights from all over the world, including Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the pertain rainforest of Guatemala. Due to its ability to detect with high precision architecture covered in dense overgrowth, LiDAR has been hailed by many as a revolution in archaeological practice. The exciting potential of this technique has led to a boom in LiDAR surveys, with researchers rushing to understand how they can process and interpret their data. Some are even proposing to map the entire Earth with LiDAR scanners to promote archaeological conservation. However, with the rapid implementation of LiDAR surveys across the globe, ethical considerations are beginning to arise. Within the current literature, there is a consensus among researchers that LiDAR ethics have to date not received sufficient attention in archaeology. Much of the current literature builds heavily on pre-existing remote sensing ethical considerations, such as a concern with data management and international collaboration. As a result, the issues of storing and sharing LiDAR datasets have become focal points of debate. How can investigators ensure that millions or billions of data points along with their metadata are safely stored for future research? Building from this concern is the issue of how to share the collected information. So those who support open access to data argue that geospatial data sets should be made widely available to the general public. In the case of many US government-funded projects, it is standard to release LiDAR data sets within a given period after a survey was conducted. The Canadian and Mexican governments also engage in a similar practice of data sharing. Yet many archaeologists have rightly countered that our work poses challenges to universal data access. As stewards of the archaeological record, many remote sensing specialists have been concerned with looting and site conservation. By bringing attention to archaeological sites, researchers can trigger or accelerate the pace of looting. And this problem is magnified by LiDAR because of its high resolution, sometimes centimeter accuracy, and the ability to quote unquote see through the forest. This greater exposure of sites is often paired with media attention because talk of using lasers to find really old, supposedly lost stuff provides instant headlines. Although most investigators would agree that data sharing is important, the question is to whom and how data should be made available. In this direction, the Global Explorer project led by Sarah Parkak demonstrates how making archaeological remote sensing data available to the general public can push forward scientific discovery. So the US-based Global Explorer project has crowdsourced the analysis of satellite imagery to identify archaeological sites and promote conservation. After completing a tutorial, users of the Global Explorer program could look through a series of tiles, which are satellite images that represent an area of a few city blocks. Users cannot employ the tiles to commit looting because the imagery is not properly referenced with geographic coordinates. As users gain more experience looking through the tiles, they can unlock new content such as photos, articles, and more tutorials. Through this crowdsourced methodology, the Global Explorer project claims a 90% success rate of producing significant discoveries. And their Expedition Peru project boasts of over 90,000 participants who have scanned over 17 million tiles. Although the Global Explorer project has provided an innovative model with useful insights, the issue of remote surveillance, data access, and ownership have opened a dialogue on colonialism. It is well known that with little or no consent, Western nations have collected topographic imagery and cultural heritage data from other nations. In this vein, the use of aerial or spaceborne reconnaissance has raised serious concerns about espionage, national sovereignty, and the right of nations to their airspace, or perhaps even outer space. Because aerial LiDAR is conducted from small passenger aircraft, flyovers typically require permission from local governments. So no concerns here with space law. But archaeologists do have to abide by the heritage laws that exist in the places where they work. And via the flyover process, if conducted with the necessary permissions, archaeologists are promoting the sovereignty of the nations where they conduct fieldwork. Instead, discussions of colonialism in aerial LiDAR research tend to arise from the issue of data access. Several investigators have highlighted that even if all LiDAR data were made freely available online, it would not ensure that all host nations and their populace would have access. Access to software and hardware are still some of the primary means for perpetuating colonial relations between nations. And the ability to use LiDAR data highlights this problem. Processing the massive data sets requires powerful computers and specialized programs such as ArcGIS. Both the necessary hardware and software tend to be made, sold, and are most available in the US and other neocolonial seats of power. Growing from the attentiveness to international relations, often by US-based archaeologists working in other countries, there has been growing consideration of descendant local communities, such as indigenous peoples who may still live among the ruins of their ancestors. Some of the early conversation stems from critiques of previous research. For an example of this, see the work by Hernandez Diaz et al. Yet, inclusion of indigenous peoples in LiDAR and remote sensing projects in general tends to not be developed beyond recognizing that community collaboration should be a major concern. Indigenous scholars are highlighting this as a critical oversight because colonialism exists on multiple levels. Although US researchers have considered colonial or neocolonial relationships at an international level, forms of colonization that occur within nations have yet to be adequately addressed. For example, I work in Mexico, a nation mired in colonial and neo-colonial relationships with Europe and the US. As Eduardo Galeano long ago highlighted, Latin America has been a source of wealth and exploitation by foreign powers. Britain, France, the US, and others have feasted on the open veins or the resources and labor available in Mexico, while leaving locals in poverty and the nation underdeveloped for competition at the global level. Yet, if we look within Mexico itself, one can see that similar asymmetries exist between indigenous and non-indigenous groups. The oppression of indigenous peoples in Mexico has a long and perhaps familiar history that extends back to the Spanish conquest. As Spaniards colonized the Americas, they placed themselves at the apex of pre-existing hierarchies and promoted a racial narrative that demoted the Maya, Aztec, and other peoples to a lesser, at times non-human status. The organization and techniques of racial oppression remained fundamentally the same with Mexican independence. Yet the new Mexican nation appropriated the indigenous past to create an imagined community. For example, the national flag centers an interpretation of Aztec imagery, but actual Nahuatl descendants tend to live in poverty and face persistent racial discrimination. In the state of Chiapas, where I do fieldwork, the Lacandon have been racialized as timeless remnants of pre-Columbian Maya society. So that's what the image in the lower left is trying to do, establish that sort of direct connection, perhaps timelessness between the past and the present. And the myth of timelessness was fostered by a combination of factors, including anthropologists who thought that they could view the deep human past by examining contemporary small-scale societies. But over time, a combination of archaeological, ethnohistoric, and ethnographic investigation have demonstrated the Lacandon formed as a result of the Spanish conquest. Warfare, disease, and forced relocations created a situation where Maya people sought refuge from colonization deep in the rainforests of the Yucatan Peninsula. Those who fled coalesced into new or existing Yucatec Maya-speaking communities that eventually formed the Lacandon ethnic identity. Far from timeless remnants of the ancient past, war and colonial violence fundamentally shaped what the Lacandon are. To combat racial stereotypes, I work with the Lacandon descendant community to understand the history of occupation in the Mensabak region of Chiapas. As part of the ongoing Mensabak archaeological project, I've conducted 10 years of community-engaged archaeological research. The Mensabak region is home to about 150 Lacandon and Celtal Maya and is part of the wider Naha Mensabak UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. The protected areas are administered by multiple federal agencies, with the inhabitants of Mensabak and Naha serving as the on-the-ground stewards of the biosphere. Within this context of indigenous stewardship, members of the Mensabak Archaeological Project initiated a program of collaborative investigation. Inspired by Native American and indigenous critiques of archaeological practice, all investigations in Mensabak are conducted with the permission of the Mensabak community government, and locals comprise a majority of the field crew. The people of Mensabak fulfill the roles of supervisors, excavators, mappers, and laboratory personnel. This work is intersectional because men, women, Maya, and non-Maya work together to perform research. Through a collaborative investigative process, the Mensabak Archaeological Project provides a temporary stream of income and builds local capacity in transferable skills such as total station and GPS mapping, controlled survey, and soil analysis. And in this process, or via this process, we fulfill local requests to share knowledge that can aid local Maya in their stewardship of the biosphere, as well as provide expertise that youth in the community can use to enter Mexican universities. Within this collaborative context, we, meaning fellow project members that include local Maya, we initiated a community-based program of investigation. At the request of many in the local community, in the summer of 2018, I initiated work on the reconstruction of fortifications at an archaeological site within the Mensabak Biosphere. Now, this work united locals with university researchers to promote sustainable development through archaeological heritage and ecological tourism. Through this type of community-based effort, we sought to craft histories written with, by, and for a descendant community. While planning this fieldwork, the opportunity arose to commission the Houston-based National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping, NCOM, for an aerial LiDAR survey of the entire Mensabak region. And to me, this seemed like a great opportunity to document local archaeology, terrain, hydrology, and forest cover for research and conservation. Moreover, the collaborative project in Mensabak provided an opportunity to explore the applied potential of this cutting-edge technology in community archaeology. Developing from the collaborative ethos of the Mensabak Archaeological Project, I examined many details, but one stuck out in particular. To collect aerial LiDAR data, researchers only need national and not necessarily local consent. So think here how Google can map your homes without asking permission. To address this and some of the ethical issues I discussed earlier, namely colonial legacies, I sought the informed consent of Mensabak community members to do LiDAR. In a community meeting, we discussed the basics of aerial LiDAR and potential outcomes of the data collection, including how it could benefit locals. Our collaborative methodology drew inspiration from McEnany et al.'s community-based mapping in Highland, Guatemala, and the principle of informed consent outlined in the American Anthropological Association's Principles of Professional Responsibility. For the formal part of the community gathering, I worked with Mensabak Archaeological Project founder Joel Palka to deliver a PowerPoint presentation designed to facilitate discussion of past field seasons and future plans for potentially conducting an aerial LiDAR survey. The use of illustrations in place of text was important because many people in the community struggle with or cannot read. The importance of engaging imagery was stressed by local colleagues who warned us that too much text would alienate community members. After explaining the basics of aerial LiDAR, similar to how I have done in this talk, we covered the reasons for why this method of data collection could be useful in creating topographic, archaeological, and forestry maps for the community and future researchers. We also discussed how the collected data would be managed, including the Mexican federal requirements for data sharing and dissemination. Numerous times during the presentation, we stated that anyone could stop us if they had questions. And although the formal part of the presentation was less conversational than we hoped, the informal question and answer led to a lively dialogue. During the question and answer, we covered a range of topics, including further consideration of how the process of aerial LiDAR could be applied in Mensabak to generate potential benefits for the community. And after some discussion that was a mix of Spanish and Lacandon Mayan, we asked locals for their permission to map the entire biosphere. The community leader and other local heads agreed to allow the mapping project. Ultimately, many expressed that they could see the benefits for researchers as well as their community. A phrase we commonly heard was that it would be nice to have a record of the community. In other words, many saw the LiDAR as providing a snapshot of the town and biosphere that could be passed down to future generations. Many also anticipated potential economic benefits through the creation of more engaging maps to display information about local businesses and sites for tourists. Consequently, as I work with the LiDAR data, I will also work with locals to create the maps they request. The processing and analysis of the aerial LiDAR data will be ongoing for many years, but future plans for research include a deeper engagement with locals in the process of geospatial analysis. And this type of collaboration will require obtaining computers for the community that have sufficient computing power to process LiDAR datasets in a GIS software. Once the hardware and programming are secure, The plan is to provide opportunities for locals to train in the use of GIS software and the analysis of digital geospatial information. But we will have to wait for the current pandemic to subside in order to implement these plans. So, in conclusion, the powerful, potentially revolutionary technique of aerial LiDAR mapping has opened an important new avenue for ethical praxis. If making data accessible to combat colonial and neocolonial relations is truly a concern, then we cannot ignore the issue of internal colonization. Native American and indigenous scholars are charting a path forward through the implementation of collaborative methods, which the Mensabak Archaeological Project has employed and fine-tuned for our particular context. Long-term collaboration allowed us to understand local culture and governance structure to effectively implement a program of informed consent. Although obtaining local consent may slow the pace of research and create numerous questions about stakeholder engagement, remote sensing indigenous lands and their heritage without consent is essentially colonial reconnaissance. However, if we actively incorporate indigenous voices and concerns to develop a program of investigation, then we can decolonize the research process and engage in more ethical science. Thank you very much.